Acts 21, verse 39. But Paul said, I am a man which am a Jew of Tarsus, a city in Cilicia, a citizen of no mean city, and I beseech thee, suffer me to speak unto the people. So Paul tells them where he was from. Now, this is going to get interesting tonight because I'm going to teach you a few things that are speculative possibly, so it's something for you to think about. And I'm going to teach you some things about the situation with Saul, and see if you can follow along with me here tonight, and kind of catch on to what's going on. And Luke, some interesting facts about Luke. This is probably why Paul was present at the stoning of Stephen, because he was with that group in Cilicia. So I believe, like some of the other commentators do, that Paul actually probably tried to refute Stephen and he could not. Okay. That Paul could not refute Stephen. He couldn't. Right? He tried to, some believe, but he couldn't do it. So something to think about there with that. Okay? Now, next that we see here is these groups. Who are these people? Who are they? Well, the libertines first. The word is Latin, and it means properly a freedman, a man who had been a slave and was set at liberty. Many have supposed that these persons were manumitted slaves of Roman origin, but who had become proselyted to the Jewish religion and who had a synagogue in Jerusalem. This opinion is not very probable, says one, though it is certain from Tacitus that there were many persons of this description at Rome. He says that 4,000 Jewish proselytes of Roman slaves made free were sent at one time to Sardinia. So what they're saying is that there were these groups, these libertines, and they were enslaved by Rome, and then they were set free and made free man. Remember Paul said, but I was born free. Remember when Paul said that? He was a citizen. He was born. He wasn't one of those. But he said these people, the libertines, there's a good chance that they were slaved and then made free. And then they became Jews, Jewish proselytes. A second opinion is that these persons were Jews by birth and had been taken captives by the Romans and then set at liberty and were thus called freedmen, which is probably more probable. That there were many Jews of this description, there can be no doubt. Pompey the Great, when he subjugated Judea, sent large numbers of the Jews to Rome. That's what Philo said. And Philo was one of their philosophers. He was one of their major movers, which we'll talk about here. Or maybe that was Plato. But these Jews were set at liberty at Rome and assigned to a place beyond the Tiber for a residence. These persons by Philo were called libertines or freedmen. Many Jews were also conveyed as captives of the king of Egypt and obtained a residence in that country in the vicinity. Another opinion is they took their name from some place which they occupied. This opinion is more probable from the fact that all the other persons mentioned here are named from countries that they occupied. Sudeus says that this is the name of a place. In one of the fathers, this passage occurs. They said Victor, Bishop of Catholic Church at Libertina. So there are some historical speculations that where these people came from are why they are identified the way that they are. But, that's what Dr. Pierce says. He's up here somewhere. I have his works up here somewhere. Bishop Pierce said that. The freedmen, thousands of Jews have been carried away captives and sold into slavery by Pompey in 63 BC. These are their children. Were mostly freed at a later period. Those of them who returned to Jerusalem had a synagogue of their own. The Cyrenians, natives of the city or country of Cyrene. That's the next group. The Cyrenians. They were natives of that city. And from whence were many Jews, such as Simon the Cyrenian. Remember him? Simon the Cyrenian, the father of Alexander and Rufus, who carried the cross of Christ after him. Turn to Mark 15. Mark 15, verse 21. And they compel one Simon a Cyrenian who passed by coming out of the country, the father of Alexander and Rufus, to bear his cross. So there we see him. We see a man that was of that sect. He carried the cross of Jesus. Either they belonged to the same synagogue with the Libertines, or rather they severally had distinct synagogues. And this will not seem strange when it is said that there were in Jerusalem 480 synagogues, though it is elsewhere said 460. So there's a dispute whether it's 460, 480, give or take a few, right? The more fully we investigate this subject, the more strongly. Okay, so now we're going to get into this. Cyrene, right? We'll talk about that. There is a man by the name of Lucius of Cyrene, right, in Acts chapter 13. Now, there is a dispute whether this is Luke or not. It's an interesting one. So I'm going to give you both versions of that as far as what people believe about that. Acts chapter 13, verse number 1. Now there were in the church that was at Antioch certain prophets and teachers, as Barnabas and Simeon that was called Niger, and Lucius of Cyrene, and Manaen, which had been brought up with Herod the Tetrarch, and Saul. So this Lucius of Cyrene in Acts 13:1, he was himself a Cyrenian and attended at this synagogue. Supposing, according to our note, which I'm going to read you on Luke 24:13, that he was one of the two from Emmaus. So this man believes that Luke was Lucius, was the same as Lucius, or Lucas, which he's called, the Italian tongue, the Greek tongue, and such, that he was one of the men on the road to Emmaus. And he arrived in Jerusalem from Cyrene by the way of Alexandria, perhaps, at the Passover, the crucifixion, and was some way connected with the Christian disciples. He was a physician, and both Cyrene and Alexandria were medically celebrated. So they were big medical places. He was thence at Pentecost, as his full narrative of the preparation of the Pentecost, as well as his full report of the speeches of Peter. So Luke gives some interesting insight, right? He was part of the Pentecostal church through the whole 6 or 7 years of its history. Then on the stoning of Stephen and the dispersion, he was one of the men of Cyrene who went first to Cyprus and thence to Antioch, where he is the Lucius of Cyrene in Acts 13:1. So this is his theory. So if you follow the names down the line, this is what he believes, and he believes that Luke put his name like that on purpose because of the account of Italians and Greeks, that he purposely put his name that way for a reason. Is it true? I don't know. It's interesting. It's very interesting if you follow it. Here's his note on that he was talking about earlier, the man that wrote this. Alford and Wadsworth and most later commentators decide, without giving reason for it, that Lucas is identical not with Lucius, but with Lucanius. There is no philological reason that we are able to discover why it may not be identical with either or both. The root of the name is lux or light, of which Lucanus, Lucius, and Lucilius are adjective forms, signifying luminous, and actually appearing in our English word lucid. So he was born, anyway, so he goes on to, I won't read you that doesn't really matter, but Alfred objects that it is improbable that Paul would call the same man at one time Lucius and another at Lucas. But the senior apostle was variously called Simon, Simeon, Cephas, and Peter. All in the same Bible. Right? And it's interesting because of what Luke knew and how he wrote that and where he was. And when he talks about, and we sailed, and you see them, that's Luke being with them. That's what that means. When he says we sailed, that's Luke saying we, because Luke is the author or the penner of the book of Acts. So Luke is saying, and we sailed, I sailed with Paul. That's what he's saying when he says we sailed. Every time you see that we there, he's speaking of himself being there with Paul. So it is interesting. But this takes studying your Bible to look at these things and kind of bounce around and check them out. It doesn't really matter a whole lot, but it does make sense if you look at it. So it will be found that our historian is called Lucius in his Roman relations and Lucas in his Greek. Wordsworth refers for his authority to Bentley's Latin, but our own examination of that very learned treatise discloses rather a proof than a disproof of the identity of Lucius and Lucas. The only matter touching on this point we can there find is a full list of examples of parallel names. So he's saying there are parallel names in the Bible. that they were used. The coincidences between Lucius and Luke are very decisive. Lucius is a prophet and a teacher, and so is Luke, being a preacher and an evangelist. Lucius is at Antioch. Luke was so permanently at Antioch as to be very generally held by ecclesiastical writers at Antioch. Lucius at Corinth joins Paul in his salutations. Romans 16:21. Turn there. I asked David Ickus about it because he studied a lot. He said he's heard that, but he's never really chased it down before. So because he studied the book of Acts for a couple years, and it was interesting, that he had heard that before too. He says, Timotheus, my workfellow, and Lucius and Jason, and Sosipater, my kinsman, salute you. So he's addressing him there with him at the time, which is interesting. But Luke had preceded Paul at Corinth as the bearer of his epistle thither in 2 Corinthians 8. So turn there, 2 Corinthians 8. I'm giving you some of this more teachy stuff here to kind of get you to understand the historical background a little bit of what's going on here. And possibly this was just kind of a side trail with Luke, but it was an interesting one. 2 Corinthians 8. In verse number 18, he says, and we have sent with him the brother whose praise is in the gospel throughout all the churches. So he's dealing with them. And remember, he said, only Luke is with me now. Do you remember that? He said that in another epistle too as well. It was in writing to Rome that Paul uses the Roman form of the name. It was in writing at Rome, his Acts, that Luke here uses the Roman form. Luke here records his name because he is giving the exact list of the authorizers of the first regular Christian mission. By this view, we see that Luke, who professes that in the gospel he had to use others as eyewitnesses, is in his Acts essentially an eyewitness, we may say, throughout the whole. He was in Palestine from the resurrection to the dispersion of the Pentecostal church. He is now at Antioch, where his history centers to the end of the 15th chapter. So Luke is with Paul all the way through there in those travels that he went on. So anyway, is Luke of Cyrene, is that him? I'm not sure, but it could be. And it's something to think about. Now, the next group is the Alexandrians, inhabitants of Alexandria in Egypt. We know about Alexandria, not a great place for a number of reasons. That city was founded by Alexander the Great in 332 BC and was populated by colonies of Greeks and Jews. It was much celebrated and contained not less than 300,000 free citizens and as many slaves. The city was the residence of many Jews. Josephus says that Alexander himself assigned to them a particular quarter of the city and allowed them equal privileges with the Greeks. So Josephus says that a group of the Jews, they were given free access. They were given their own city, part of the city, and they ruled that, and he made them free there, and they could do whatever they wanted pretty much. He allowed them equal privileges with the Greeks. Philo affirms that of 5 parts of the city, the Jews inhabited 2. So there's a lot of Jews there in Alexandria. That became a big group. According to his statement, there dwelt in his time at Alexandria and the other Egyptian cities not less than 100,000 Jews. Amron, the general of Omar, when he took the city, said that it contained 40,000 tributary Jews. At this place, the famous version of the Old Testament called the Septuagint of the Alexandrian version was made, which we don't like. Alexandria, the chief maritime city, and for a long time, the metropolis of Lower Egypt, received its name from its founder, Alexander the Great. So a lot was going on. He favored the Jewish race there. He gave them, they were educated, wealthy, and influential. The Jews never had a man greater in erudition than Philo, who adorned this city with his genius and left works extant and valued at the present day. Here the Hebrew Old Testament was translated to the Greek, forming the celebrated Septuagint. Celebrated by some, anyway. Anyway, so that's the history of there. Then Cilicia. This province, geographically speaking, occupied the southeastern division of what is now known as Asia Minor. Many Jews were settled there. A colony of Jews was settled there by Antiochus the Great. It was at this time a Roman province. St. Paul was a native of Cilicia, and there is no doubt but that among the rabbis and teachers of the Sicilian synagogue who met and argued with Stephen, Not the least distinguished was the brilliant pupil of Gamaliel, the young man Saul. So understand something. Paul is going to come into play at this chapter. You're going to see at the end of this chapter, you're going to see they threw what at the foot of what? Their coats at what? The foot of who? Who was it? Saul. Right? So you're going to see that, I believe, or chapter 7, actually. I believe it's the end of chapter 7. Right? And they stoned Stephen, calling upon God. Let's see. 58. And cast him out of the city and stoned him, and the witnesses laid down their clothes at a young man's feet, whose name was Saul. So Saul was there. You know, we're not going to talk about him yet, but think about this thought. What do you believe that man went through the rest of his life? Thinking about Stephen being stoned in front of him. Yeah, that's why Paul said that about himself. That's why Paul felt that way. That's why he labored more abundantly than they all. That's why he worked so hard in the gospel. That's why he did it. Because he killed the Lord's people, and he was there when Stephen was murdered. He was there, right? So it bothered him. It always would bother him until he was dead, right? He would remember that. And he was the brilliant student of Gamaliel, so he probably got up there, couldn't dispute him, so then they killed him because he couldn't withstand his words, right? John Gill says the metropolis of which country was Tarsus. I make no doubt about it that Saul of Tarsus was among them or belonged to this synagogue and was one of the fierce disputants with Stephen, John Gill says, at least violently opposed him, since he afterward held the clothes of those that stoned him. Then we have those from Asia as well that we could talk about, but that gives you the understanding of what was happening there. Stephen now, as we get into him a little bit more. So those are the three sects that were there at the time. Those are the synagogues. Those were the ones that all came against Stephen. They all came against Stephen. They all came to fight against him and to challenge him. And when they couldn't, well, you'll see what happens, right? So next we see that Stephen, he can do miracles. He is able to do miracles here. And the word of God increased, and the number of the disciples multiplied in Jerusalem greatly, and a great company of the priests were obedient to the faith. And Stephen, full of faith and of power, did great wonders and miracles among the people. So he had received his anointing from the apostles, and he had hands laid on him by them. And that's the reason Stephen could do those miracles. To date, he is the first one that we can see that had the power to do those miracles that was not an apostle. But he is the first one. And he's also killed right